The dark truth about the brothers' home in South Korea. Behind South Korea's incredible rise to success lies a shocking story that remained hidden for decades. A place meant to help the vulnerable turned into a nightmare of abuse, cruelty, and unimaginable suffering. This is the dark truth of the brothers' home, where survival meant enduring horrors no one should ever face. Join us as we uncover the chilling reality of what happened behind those walls and the brave survivors who fought to share their truth. If you find their story as important as we do, make sure to like, subscribe, and share. Together, we can ensure these stories are never forgotten. Deep beneath the gleaming surface of South Korea's success story lies a dark chapter that few dared to speak about for many years. While the world celebrated the country's amazing journey from poverty to prosperity, a terrible truth remained hidden from view. In the shadows of this modern nation, there existed places so horrible that those who survived them could only compare them to the concentration camps of World War II. Unlike the fictional horrors of shows like Squid Game that captivate audiences today, these places were terrifyingly real, and the people trapped inside fought not for prize money, but for their very survival. The truth stayed buried for decades because the survivors carried too much pain to speak about it. Many stayed quiet for over 25 years, afraid that no one would believe them or that speaking up might bring more trouble. The few who did talk painted pictures of places straight out of nightmares, facilities that were supposed to help people, but instead became prisons where the weak and vulnerable suffered endless cruelty. These places had a name: the brothers' home. They were supposed to be centers that helped people in need, but instead, they became prisons where innocent people, young children, hardworking adults, and helpless elderly faced treatment that no human being should ever endure. When the truth finally broke free, people could hardly believe that such evil could exist in their modern world. How had nobody noticed? How had the government allowed this to happen? The answers to these questions would reveal a web of lies and cover-ups that went on for years. Even today, decades after these camps were finally shut down, the pain hasn't gone away. The survivors still wake up with nightmares, carrying invisible scars that may never fully heal. Their stories stand as dark reminders of how easily terrible things can happen when people look the other way. The early 1980s in South Korea looked peaceful on the outside. You would see families going about their daily lives, hear children playing in the streets, and feel the buzz of cities growing bigger and better. But underneath this calm picture, something evil was spreading its roots, destroying families and stealing innocent lives. Among these stories was Chong's, a 12-year-old boy whose life changed forever in ways no child should experience. He wasn't just any kid, he was special. His teachers knew him as the bright student who always got top marks. At home, he was even more remarkable. Despite being so young, he took care of his sick mother like a grown-up, cooking meals and keeping their small house in order. He was all his mother had, her ray of sunshine in dark times. Then came 1982, the year that turned their world upside down. It started innocently enough. A neighbor, someone they trusted, offered to show Chong around the big city. For a boy from a quiet neighborhood, the city was like stepping into another world. The bright lights, the noise, the exciting arcade games, everything seemed magical. Chong's eyes lit up with wonder as he took it all in, never suspecting that this wonderful day would lead to horror. The trap closed when the neighbor disappeared for what he said would be just a minute. As Chong waited alone, 2 policemen walked up to him. They seemed friendly, asking him questions with kind smiles on their faces. They said they wanted to help him get home safely. But their real intentions were far from helpful. Like most children who see a police officer's uniform, Chong felt safe saying yes when they offered to help. He thought they would take him back to his worried mother. Instead, they led him to the police station, and with that simple trip, his whole life changed forever. He wasn't the only one caught in this trap that day. Not far away, a little 7-year-old girl named Miss Lee was walking with her younger brother when their own nightmare began in exactly the same way, with police officers offering to help them get home. The officers spoke softly and kindly to the children, telling them everything would be okay. Hours passed at the police station, and then the children were told to get into a white van. From the outside, it looked like any other van you might see on the street. But when the doors opened, the children saw something that made their hearts sink. The van was already full of people. both grown-ups and children, all looking scared and lost. Nobody spoke much during the ride. They just sat there, wondering where they were going and why this was happening to them. When the van finally stopped, the children found themselves staring at a place that would haunt their dreams forever. High concrete walls stretched up toward the sky, making them feel tiny and helpless. Guards stood everywhere, watching their every move with cold eyes. The walls weren't just for show, they were meant to keep people in, like a real prison. The huge steel doors clanged shut behind them with a sound that seemed to say, "There's no going back now." Inside, the buildings were packed with people. The rooms where everyone slept were so crowded it seemed impossible. Bunk beds were squeezed together like sardines in a can, with up to 100 people sharing a space meant for far fewer. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. For new arrivals like Chong and Miss Lee, the worst part came next. The guards didn't just take away their freedom, they took away everything that made them who they were. First came the haircuts, every head shaved completely bald, no exceptions. Then came the uniforms, rough blue clothes with stripes that scratched their skin. But the cruelest change was when they took away their names. From that moment on, they weren't Chong or Miss Lee anymore. They were just numbers. Looking around at each other in their matching uniforms with their shaved heads and number tags, they barely recognized themselves. It was like they had stopped being people and become something else, something less than human. Every day started the same way, and it started early. At 5 o'clock in the morning, when the sky was still dark, loud alarms would shock everyone awake. No matter how tired they were, no matter how cold it was, everyone had to jump up and run outside to line up. They would stand there shivering and scared as the guards checked to make sure everyone was there. The camp tried to look normal from the inside. It had everything a small town might have. There were factories where people worked, a school building, a church for Sunday services, even a place where they could get haircuts and take baths. But it was all fake, like a terrible play where everyone was forced to act their part. The guards made everyone behave like they were in the army. They had to salute, follow strict rules, and never, ever show their true feelings. The worst part was what happened to people who broke the rules. Even the smallest mistake could lead to terrible punishment. If someone cried, and many did, they would get beaten. If they worked too slowly, they would get beaten. If they didn't salute properly or bow deep enough, they would get beaten. Chong later told stories about how his body was always covered in cuts and bruises. Just when the old ones started to heal, new ones would appear. The guards used whips, wooden rods, and their fists. They didn't seem to care that many of their victims were just children. Life inside the camp was an endless cycle of backbreaking work. Nobody was spared, not even the smallest children. In the factory where Chong spent his days, the air was thick with dust and the sound of machines. He was put to work making fishing rods, his small hands forced to handle sharp tools that were never meant for children. By the end of each day, his fingers would be covered in cuts and blood. But the work never stopped. If they didn't make enough rods, the guards would make sure they remembered their failure with fists and whips. Hunger was everyone's constant companion. The food they received was barely enough to keep them alive. Just small bowls of watery soup and hard rice that felt like pebbles in their mouths. People became so desperate for food that they would catch and eat rats, anything to fill their empty stomachs. They wore the same clothes day after day until they were little more than rags. Things we take for granted, like having our own toothbrush, were luxury items in the camp. Often, dozens of people had to share a single toothbrush, spreading sickness from one person to another. The children in the camp had their childhood stolen from them. Instead of playing games and learning in school, they watched terrible things happen every day. They saw their friends being beaten, heard screams in the night, and learned that crying would only make things worse. Even when they could finally close their eyes at night, peace wouldn't come. The fear of what tomorrow might bring kept them tossing and turning on their hard beds. The women in the camp faced horrors that are almost too painful to talk about. The guards treated them like they weren't even human beings. Many women were hurt in ways that left scars deeper than any physical wound. Those who became pregnant faced even more cruelty. Instead of getting help and care, they were forced to take mysterious injections that made them lose their babies. The pain they endured was unimaginable, both in their bodies and in their hearts. The men weren't safe either. They too suffered terrible abuse at the hands of the guards. Some survivors later found the courage to draw pictures of what happened to them when words felt too hard to say. But many others kept silent, locking away their memories like they had once been locked in their cells. The weight of what happened was too heavy to carry, too dark to bring into the light. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part of the camp was a place the survivors called the Zombie Zone. This was where they kept people with disabilities, but calling it care would be a cruel joke. The guards kept these prisoners so drugged up that they could barely think or move. They stumbled around like people in a bad dream, unable to take care of themselves or even understand what was happening to them. Many of them simply faded away, their spirits broken long before their bodies gave up. The camp didn't just hurt people's bodies, it tried to destroy who they were as human beings. Every day, the guards worked to break down their prisoners' sense of self. They took away names and gave numbers. They separated families, ripping children from their parents' arms. Many of these families never found each other again, even after the camp was closed. Letters from the outside world never came in, and no messages ever made it out. It was like being buried alive, cut off from everything and everyone you loved. Just when it seemed like these horrors would never end, a simple hunting trip changed everything. In December 1986, a prosecutor named Kim Yong-hwan was out hunting with his friends from work. He had no idea that what he was about to discover would finally bring light to one of South Korea's darkest secrets. As he walked through the woods that day, he couldn't have known he was about to uncover a truth that would shake his country to its core. That December day in the forest changed everything. When Prosecutor Kim stumbled upon the scene, he couldn't believe his eyes. What he saw looked like something from a nightmare, not something that should exist in modern South Korea. Workers shuffled along in chains, their feet bound together like prisoners from ancient times. Behind them, guards swung long sticks and clubs, hitting anyone who moved too slowly. The worst part was the dogs, big, angry animals that snapped and growled at the terrified workers. He watched in horror as these people, who looked more dead than alive, were pushed into a building that looked like it was made for storing farm animals, not housing human beings. Mr. Kim knew he couldn't just walk away from what he'd seen. Following his duty as a prosecutor, he went to investigate the camp's main office. What he found there was shocking. Stacks and stacks of money, adding up to 20 million won. This wasn't just some small operation. This was big business. At the center of it all was a man named Park In-gown who ran the camp like his own private kingdom. When Mr. Kim questioned him, Park didn't even try to hide what he was doing. Instead, he smiled and bragged about his connections to powerful people. Park's confidence came from a dark truth. He had been chosen for this job by President Chun Doo-hwan himself. The government paid him for every person brought to the camp, like they were collecting things instead of human beings. This led to a terrible system where police officers would grab anyone they could find. They weren't just taking homeless people or orphans, they were snatching regular people right off the streets. Later studies showed that most of the people in the camp, almost 70 out of every 100, had homes and families before they were taken. The police had turned hunting people into a twisted game. They got points for every person they brought in, like children collecting stamps. More points meant better jobs and more money. They stopped seeing people as human beings and started seeing them as ways to get ahead in their careers. Some officers would grab entire families, breaking apart homes just to earn more points. The timing of all this became even more sinister in 1981 when South Korea learned it would host the 1988 Olympics. The government wanted to make the country look perfect for all the visitors who would come. Their solution was simple but cruel. Round up anyone who might make the country look bad and hide them away in places like the brothers' home. They called it beautification, but there was nothing beautiful about it. Park had turned the camp into his own money-making machine. The factories inside worked people to exhaustion, making things like fishing rods that he sold for pure profit. Nobody asked questions about where these products came from or who made them. But perhaps the most twisted part of all was how Park used religion to control people. He forced everyone to go to church services where preachers would tell them that their suffering was what God wanted. They had to sing religious songs while being beaten and starved. Many survivors said this hurt them deeper than any physical pain. seeing their faith used as another weapon against them. When the truth started coming out, Park went on television to defend himself. He acted like he was the victim, saying he was just trying to help clean up the streets. Surprisingly, some people actually believed him. They liked that they didn't have to see homeless people or orphans anymore, choosing to ignore what was happening to those who disappeared. They praised the brothers' home for making their neighborhoods look nicer, not caring about the price paid in human suffering. But Prosecutor Kim couldn't ignore what he'd seen. He was determined to dig deeper and expose the truth, no matter what it cost him. Then the phone calls started coming in. His bosses, people high up in the government, began reaching out to him. As he picked up each call, he could feel the weight of what he was up against growing heavier and heavier. The phone calls that Prosecutor Kim received shook his faith in everything he believed about justice. These weren't threats from criminals, they were requests from his own bosses, people he had trusted and respected. They kept asking him to go easy on Mr. Park, to give him a lighter punishment. For Kim, it felt like watching his whole world turn upside down. How could someone who had done such terrible things walk away with just a slap on the wrist just because they knew powerful people? The bigger picture was even darker. South Korea at that time was ruled by President Chun Doo-hwan, a man many people feared and hated. The streets often filled with angry protesters, ordinary people demanding their freedom from his iron-fisted rule. Anyone who dared to speak against him quickly learned how dangerous that could be. His government had a way of making people disappear, sometimes into places just like the brothers' home. When people finally learned about what was happening at the brothers' home, everyone thought things would change. The camp was shut down in 1987 as angry citizens demanded action. But closing one camp didn't solve the problem. It was like cutting off one head of a monster only to see it grow back somewhere else. The same terrible things kept happening, just with different names and in different places, hidden away from public view. For the people who made it out, freedom wasn't the happy ending they had dreamed about. Many had been just little children when they were taken, so young that their memories of home had faded away like old photographs. They couldn't remember their parents' faces or even their own addresses. With nowhere else to go, many ended up living in orphanages or on the streets. Some were sent to mental hospitals, their minds still trapped in the nightmare they had lived through. The pain these survivors carried wasn't just in their bodies, it was in their hearts and minds too. They felt different from everyone else, marked by what had happened to them. Many people looked down on them, thinking they must have done something wrong to end up in the camp in the first place. This just made everything harder. How do you build a new life when people treat you like you're broken? Finding their families again seemed almost impossible. Imagine not even remembering your mother's name or what street you used to live on. Some families had spent years searching for their missing children, putting up posters, and asking everyone they met if they had seen them. But many of these searches ended with empty hands and broken hearts. Years of poor food, hard work, and strange drugs had left many survivors with health problems that would last their whole lives. Simple things that most people take for granted, like having a job or making friends, felt like climbing a mountain. Their bodies were tired, their minds were haunted by memories, and their hearts were heavy with sadness. Most survivors kept quiet about what had happened to them for many, many years. They worried that people wouldn't believe them or would blame them for what had happened. After all, the government, the very people who were supposed to protect them, had been part of their suffering. How could they trust anyone after that? But in 2012, something remarkable happened. After more than 25 years of silence, some survivors found the courage to speak up. One of them was Mr. Han, who had been just a small boy of 9 when he was taken to the camp. Now a grown man of 37, he stood outside a courthouse holding a sign that told his story. That simple act of bravery would help break down the wall of silence that had hidden this terrible chapter of history for so long. All we want is to feel normal again. These words from Mr. Han's sign touched something deep in people's hearts. Like throwing a stone into still water, his brave act created ripples that spread far and wide. Other survivors began stepping out of the shadows, each one carrying their own heavy bundle of memories. Stories of endless work, of beatings, of nights spent hungry and afraid. But even as they found the strength to speak up, they ran into a wall. The courts and police kept turning them away, saying too many years had passed to do anything about it now. This meant that Park, the man who had made their lives a living nightmare, would never have to answer for what he did. He had gotten rich off their suffering, building a fortune from their forced labor and pain. When reporters tried to ask him about it in his final years, he played dumb, claiming his mind wasn't working right anymore because he was old. He died in 2016, taking all his secrets to the grave. For the survivors, it felt like losing their last chance at answers. But they refused to let their story end there. For almost 3 years, they camped outside the courthouse through hot summers and freezing winters. They weren't going to be ignored anymore. Their determination finally paid off in 2020 when the court agreed to look at their case again, focusing on all the terrible things that happened back in the 1970s and 1980s. But even this victory felt hollow. The wheels of justice turned so slowly that it seemed like they weren't moving at all. The government's silence hurt almost as much as their original pain. These were the same people who had paid for every person brought to the brothers' home, who had looked the other way while children were beaten and starved. Now they wouldn't even say sorry. It was like being hurt all over again, watching the people responsible just walk away like nothing had happened. For the survivors, this wasn't just about getting revenge or making people pay for what they did. They wanted their stories to be heard. They needed people to understand what had happened to them, to make sure nothing like this could ever happen to anyone else. As grown-ups, they finally had voices strong enough to speak up, even if it felt like no one was really listening. The brothers' home might have closed its doors years ago, but for the survivors, it never really ended. The memories followed them everywhere like shadows they couldn't shake off. Every day was a battle to heal, to find out who they were beyond what had been done to them. Some days were harder than others. Nights when the nightmares came back, or moments when a sudden sound or smell would bring everything rushing back. Society's lack of understanding made everything harder. People who hadn't been through it couldn't understand why the survivors couldn't just get over it and move on. This left many feeling alone with their pain, like islands cut off from the mainland of normal life. The happy, innocent children they had once been were gone forever, replaced by adults carrying wounds that no one could see. Perhaps the cruelest part was how people treated them once they knew where they had been. Being connected to the brothers' home was like wearing an invisible sign that said damaged or unwanted. This made everything harder. Finding a job, making friends, falling in love. Some employers would turn them away as soon as they learned about their past. Others would treat them like they were somehow less than human, just like the guards at the camp had done. For those taken as very young children, the pain went even deeper. They had lost not just their freedom, but their very identity. Many couldn't remember their mother's faces or their father's voices. Some had forgotten their own birth names. They walked the streets wondering if any of the strangers passing by might be their long-lost family members. The childhood memories that most people cherish, birthday parties, family dinners, first days of school, had been replaced by memories of concrete walls and endless work. Out of their deep pain, the survivors found an incredible strength. They refused to let their stories stay buried in the past. Through peaceful protests on cold streets, honest interviews that brought tears to viewers' eyes, and powerful documentaries that showed the world what really happened, they shined a light on one of the darkest corners of South Korea's history. Each time they spoke up, it was like adding another crack to the wall of silence that had protected the guilty for so long. These brave survivors weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for something bigger, their basic human dignity. They wanted the government to stand up and say, yes, this happened and we were wrong. They wanted more than just words. They wanted real changes that would make sure no other children would ever be snatched off the streets and locked away like they were. They wanted the system that had failed them so badly to learn from its mistakes and become better. Even when it felt like nobody was listening, even when powerful people tried to sweep their stories under the rug, they kept pushing forward. Their courage touched people's hearts, and slowly but surely others began to stand with them. Regular people, young and old, began to understand that this wasn't just about something that happened in the past. It was about making sure it could never happen again. The survivors' fight became everyone's fight. Their story teaches us something important: how easily terrible things can happen when people look the other way. The brothers' home wasn't hidden in some far-off place. It was right there in plain sight. People drove past its walls every day, never knowing what was happening inside. It shows us how important it is to speak up when we see something wrong, to not just accept what we're told when something doesn't feel right. But this isn't just a story about pain and suffering. It's also a story about hope, about how even the people who have been hurt the most can find the strength to stand up and fight back. The survivors could have stayed quiet, could have tried to forget everything that happened to them. Instead, they chose to speak out, to fight not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been silenced or forgotten. Through their bravery, they've made sure that the brothers' home won't just be another forgotten chapter in a history book. They've turned their painful memories into a powerful lesson for future generations. Their message is clear: we must never stop watching out for each other, never stop questioning those in power, never stop fighting for what's right. As we look back on this dark chapter of history, we're left with important questions about our own world today. Where are the brothers' homes of our time? What injustices are happening right now that people are choosing not to see? The survivors have shown us that staying silent is the same as saying it's okay for bad things to happen. Their legacy isn't just about remembering what happened, it's about doing something with that knowledge. It's about building a world where children are protected, where the weak aren't preyed upon by the strong, where no one can disappear without someone asking questions. The survivors of the brothers' home have given us this gift: the understanding that every one of us has the power and the responsibility to stand up against cruelty and injustice. In the end, this isn't just their story, it's everyone's story. It's about what happens when good people do nothing, but also about what can change when brave people refuse to stay silent. The survivors of the brothers' home have shown us that even in the darkest places, hope can survive. Their courage challenges each of us to ask ourselves, what will we do when we see something wrong? Will we look away, or will we stand up and speak out?